Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Have you heard that phrase before? This adage has been attributed to many different figures. Even Mother Jones, the famous labor activist, and Eleanor Roosevelt. But in truth, it was first drafted in a slightly different form in 1902 by a journalist, Finley Peter Dunn. Dunn used it to describe the purpose of the newspaper in society, to be a watchdog for corporate corruption and greed, along with such anecdotes as follow the money and speak truth to power. The field of journalism in those early days prided itself on a prophetic morality, a desire to expose people to the truth, to defend the vulnerable with the beauty of facts. The newspaper was regarded as a free pulpit of sorts, and its revered preachers, journalists oriented towards provoking social change by communicating good information to the masses. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But then, much later in 1987, this phrase gained a new function, this time in the field of religion. A prominent Christian theologian, Martin Marty, picked up on the idea, and he said it was one that described a notion of God's way of being both merciful and judgmental. He interpreted it as a central mission of the church in that age, of faith, to celebrate and affirm goodness, as well as to speak out and against evil when necessary. Since then, it has been applied to many of a vocational task in the work of ministry and congregations, even preaching a sermon. It's been used to define how faith communities should engage broader social issues, such as economic or class oppression, along with its individual victims and victors. And they're often biblical verses called upon to orient this modern day mandate in some ancient wisdom. But actually the phrases comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable never appear in any of those scriptures. In sermons and other reflections, it's often used to wed the work of feeding the poor, caring for the sick, and supporting families in crisis to the prophetic task of interrupting power and compelling those who have power to change themselves, to be reoriented towards the common good. And it may have been first defined with the media in mind, but it's now been really assumed by religious voices. And it could be proposed that religious communities have that first part down. Comfort the afflicted, provide refuge, and lend a hand to those in need. And some would say that the church and journalism haven't yet fulfilled the second part of this oh so human mandate, afflict the comfortable. Well, Martin Marty and Finley Peter Dunn spoke of people who are so confident in their comfort state that they don't see the impact of their actions on other people. People who have economic privilege are well beyond what they need. People who remain happy and contented even if others around them are suffering. But I wonder, are the differences between the comfortable, those who ought to be briefed and primed in order to become generous, and those who are afflicted in need of generosity, a stark and visible boundary like they defined? Is it simply an issue of the 1% and the rest of us and the 99? Maybe. Maybe there's a totally separate sermon in here about how we motivate people to dig into financial and other resources to support social change. But today, I'm outside of that box, friends. In this blistering and somewhat relentless trauma of an election season, I'm all upside down with generosity. In these Black Lives Matter times of police violence and of movement building, I'm all askew with my understanding of what generosity really means. And in my own work, studying and trying to understand the social experiences of the 133 million Americans who experience some form of chronic illness, I'm again outside of this box when it comes to generosity. I can't really think about it like us and them, comfortable and uncomfortable. Let's look a bit more deeply at what comfort is and what it means to have a body, to be a body in this world, in today's society. If we did that, I think we'd feel urged to do a lot less afflicting and instead expand our generosity of comfort. Then we can move together towards a justice ethic that brings in our fullness, that brings in the songs we sing like a match, and helps us to unfold, to be true before each other, dear human to dear human. I don't think that we can simply partition the comfortable and the afflicted. We're all in need of comfort. In this past month of election season, we have had unrelenting public debate over accusations of violence. And we've even had backlash of unwillingness to believe women who have experienced abuse or trauma in defense of some so-called locker room talk. In dialogues between women of all generations, I have heard about experiences that have revisited or replayed to them, revisiting us. Over the course of our lives, some have found healing and comfort in places like here, in Unitarian Universalist faith and community. It has been a calm musical note, like the poet says, that we can apply to any wound and the wound heals. Maybe this is a comfort zone. But also in these times, the line is breaking. Our comfort is tied to our body's past experiences, but the brain, according to one trauma expert, Dr. Vander Kolk, says that the brain is a cultural organ. While our bodies may have begun to adjust to the present moment, living into the healing spaces of our lives, there's also an influx of triggering news memes, Facebook feeds, commentary, and infotainment that can bring us back to memories that have been encoded in our bodies. The events that at one time devastated us but are now over can bring about feelings of pain, of fatigue, of depression. And maybe for some of our families and friends, the effects of our present cultural situation might be secondary. It could be fear, which is a natural and healthy response to much of what we might witness in those we love and in the narratives of the vulnerable that we hear in the news and even still on Facebook. Or it could be the sense that one can never do enough that makes us uncomfortable, feel inadequate. This can all have a powerful influence on our lives. In her book, Trauma Stewardship, Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky talks about her experience. She says, "I know from my membership and experience in the Black community that there is a widely held belief that if we work enough, if we labor enough, if we produce enough, then we'll be safe. Being born and raised female, I internalized messages that taught me that if I nurture others enough, if I care enough, if I anticipate the other people's needs enough, then everything will be okay." And we know from the news alone that even if we may not experience violence ourselves, that individual deeds and labors cannot necessarily protect everyone. And what gets internalized is a deep, lingering sense of not being enough. Today, our cultural brains, you might say, are being afflicted, stimulated in so many ways that expose us to private sorrow and public anguish. The more I have dug into my own relationship to comfort, that second part of the statement, afflict the comfortable, becomes more difficult for me to take on as my work, as the work of a religious leader, of a seminary professor. The mandate feels more like mantra and less like faith. While trauma exposure runs so high in our society, it's hard to think of anyone as statically or permanently comfortable. What I've learned about the body and about trauma, both through my own personal experiences and through my research, it takes generosity out of the box. The generosity of comfort that can sink more deeply into our core understanding of ourselves and our own survival. It can allow a person to nurture self-love and their connection to the oneness of life that precedes all divisions, and to the relationships that give life challenge and meaning in community. Comfort is not quantifiable or a zero-sum game. When we nurture our human need for comfort, we find purpose. We can grow to take more risks. We can become newly and daringly generous with others. The human body is oriented towards these things: survival, connection, purpose. The first, survival, is obvious, a deep drive to be and to remain alive. In 2001, I experienced a robbery in front of my home, early one evening around dusk. I was physically unharmed and lost very little of my personal property, but the experience left me with significant flashbacks. Post-traumatic stress disorder, they told me. I would relive these minutes, even though they were over, even though I had survived. I soon got connected with a coach who had significant experience helping people who had experienced trauma, an approach called generative somatics. And through these weekly coaching and information sessions, I came to understand trauma as contraction, as a folding, held within the body that becomes non-responsive to our current experience, that was trying to make a cold, frozen house inside myself. Our exposure to trauma lives in the body, but it can be transformed there too. In the weeks to follow the attack, I couldn't have told the story with the relative ease that I could tell it today. I just wanted to overcome the incident and not let it get to me. It was over. It was so fast. I survived. And really, it wasn't that bad, right? I didn't want to stay folded. As Rilke wrote in our second reading, I felt that where I was folded, there I was a lie. I came to learn about the physical symptoms that were forms of release, and I could work with my body to navigate my survival reactions consciously, to find comfort and feelings of safety again, to feel capable of leaving the house or to enjoy social situations. I had to be taught to see that my body was a collaborator in my healing as opposed to a nuisance, and as generous to my comfort rather than a vessel of repressed memory. As I continued to work with my body, I learned new practices. The contractions of my body, or the foldings of my mind, softened. The choices before me broadened. It hadn't changed that I had experienced something awful, but this new gift of presence and connection to my body's experience expanded my whole sense of self and my community. It even changed my Myers-Briggs type, if you're familiar with those. Where I once tested as a solid TJ, I was now a complete FP, if you know what those types mean. More towards feeling and perception and less towards judging what was happening within myself. A few years later, I needed a major surgery, which had a long recovery. And I found that the practices I learned further prepared me to bring awareness to where my body needed comfort, needed unfolding. They helped me to navigate the long recovery and my body's responses. And today, while I think these practices and the awareness they cultivate are helping me stay present to this political moment, the triggering and the pain that is this election season, and to be here, to be right here, with my grasp of things true before you. I cannot undo a debate or a meme or a bystander witness video or distract myself from sexism or misogyny and violence. I can be with what those triggers bring for me in order to be generous with myself. As my dear coach wrote in her most recent blog entry, I will try to remember that once I stop being so incredulous that I am triggered, I can accept this opportunity to heal, and all sorts of inner and outer support will show up. Then there's nurturing love and connection. If we look to mujerista theology, which comes from Latin American women's experience, we can find a notion of self that is bound to a community. The tradition is focused on our liberation, and it doesn't accept the suffering of individual women, but rather sees self-love as wrapped up in a practice of community engagement. If we attend to the needs of the self, to our need for self-love, we are attending to the needs of community. Communities bombarded by messages that pain is everywhere, we can know that there are comfort zones, there are places of hope and peace to rest in. When I was living close to downtown Oakland, California, in the months after my attack, it was bursting with new social movement energy, the Occupy movement. Protest, vigil, and march would go right down my street, through my block. And for the first few months, I wasn't leaving the house much and never unaccompanied. But when I could hear the protest and the activists going through, I would bring myself just out to the rose bushes at the edge of my property to hear them walking right past the place where the robbery took place. And for that moment, I could stand and let my eyes fall comfortably closed and imagine their footsteps blessing and regenerating that space, carrying with them and out the pain and devastation of a community experiencing so much gentrification and poverty, under which my own momentary experience was subsumed. Our own needs for survival might sometimes feel at odds to our abilities to be connected and loved. But the connections we have with other humans are fundamental to meaningful, satisfying lives. Our connections and relationships with our human co-sufferers and co-lovers of life. The comfortable and the afflicted might actually live within us at the same time. We can find their purpose. We grow to take more meaningful risks. We can become newly and daringly generous with others. So am I asking you to throw out this social justice phrase, to never again say, afflict the comfortable, and to just quit trying to get people to give up their riches or to join social movements and to confront bigotry? No, in fact, I think that through our generosity toward comfort, our bodies begin to come online to the ways in which we need each other, and we can be directed more easily, more fluidly towards social transformation. When our survival, self-love, and human connection are not nurtured, it is hard to imagine being able to be generous in other ways. Whether it is using our privileges and talents, or giving away material wealth in order to help others and pursue justice and liberation. As Unitarian Universalists, we gather around principles, but we also gather for purpose. Toward purpose is another direction in which the human body is attuned. Beautifully described in ancient moral philosophy, when we embrace a purpose in our lives, it's part of the fine-tuning that produces eudaimonia, or flourishing. If we become extravagant in the ways we provide ourselves opportunities for self-nurture, for comfort, as part of our life's accomplishments, how much would we be willing to share out of the satisfaction with others? Would we feel less fear? Yes, some of us, maybe even many of us, experience individual forms or matrices of privilege along gender, social, and other lines. But our attempts will be undermined if we do not attend to the fact that we have bodies that have carried us through sorrow, through joy, triumphs, and low lows. Bodies that have survived, even if we might sometimes feel numb or indifferent towards them. We need comfort as we practice community, as we carry on leadership, as we make sense of the unfiltered world around us, as we take risks with each other to make life fuller and more satisfying for more people. Becoming unfolded, allowing others in to know our truths and to be comforted is a delicate process. Where we have aches, wounds, and in our broken places, we long to be comforted. And that is one task of the religious community. Let our worshiping together as a fellowship of Unitarian Universalists and newcomers unfold our generous acts. May we make meaning together out of any fatigue or ache or pain. May we trouble the waters of the status quo and change the hearts and minds of those who are indifferent to suffering. When we are asked to give, to be externally generous, may we feel less put upon by others in our midst because we've already become generous with ourselves. And most certainly now, in these final days before Election Day, may we together be vigil keepers of the lived body. May we offer ourselves comfort and divinely human connection. May each of you, may we unfold through this wild storm to safety. Love, peace, and a generous comfort to each of you. You are a blessing to our faith and to our world. Thank you.